Nisrin El Amin is Assistant Professor of Anthropology and African Studies at the University of Toronto. That's where she joins me from after making a long journey out of the fighting in Khartoum. Nisrin, thank you so much for making the time. You've only been back here in Canada for about 5 days. I mean, reflecting back on your journey home, what are some of the things that run through your mind?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for covering this. I think for me, I'm obviously incredibly relieved that I was able to leave Sudan and with my 3-year-old daughter and my elderly parents who are now in Turkey. But it's also, I'm also feeling great concern for all of my friends and family who remain in Sudan, particularly those who are in Khartoum. And I have a close friend in Niala, Darfur as well, who I've been in contact with, who are sheltering in place still. And it's now, I think, the third week of this. And they've been, my family in the neighborhood that we evacuated from still don't have electricity or water. Food is very limited. It's very difficult to access healthcare because most of the hospitals have either been hit or are just overwhelmed and there's not enough medicine. So, part of me feels really disheartened by the way that, basically the international aid agency kind of infrastructure left and leaving a great kind of vacuum behind that has been filled by these neighborhood resistance committees that have been at the forefront of the popular revolution that ousted Omar Hassan al-Bashir in 2019, April of 2019. And they're really filling this gap right now, but at great risk to themselves.
And what do you make of the international community's reaction? I mean, you talked about selective leveraging and a lot of the aid agencies ceasing operation. Before you went to Sudan, did you ever think that there might be a widespread security issue? I mean, we've been seeing these two sides in some sort of negotiations since the coup in October 2021. Did it ever occur to you that you would need to be concerned about security? And are you surprised by the international community's reaction to what happened?
That's a good question. I think most of us saw the tensions between the RSF and the SAF. They're part of the same military coup regime. Hemeti, head of the RSF, being the deputy, and Al Burhan being the head. And we were nearing a deadline in April, early April, for the signing of a political agreement that was essentially going to lead to the formation of a transitional government that would be another partnership between primarily civilian elites, some of the armed rebel groups that were incorporated into that kind of forces of freedom and change, and the military coup regime, the RSF and the SAF. And also at that time, the RSF was supposed to be kind of subsumed under the Sudanese armed forces. And so, we knew that there were tensions around that and disagreements. I personally did not anticipate that this is how these tensions would manifest themselves in a essentially a siege of Khartoum and other areas of Sudan that civilians are caught up in the middle of. They have bombed, critical infrastructure, people's homes. I think the death toll, and that's probably an underreporting, is 600, injured in the 6,000, I think is the last number I heard. There's 300,000 who have been displaced. And there are many, many more, millions potentially, who are in Khartoum and in Darfur who are not able to get out for financial and security reasons. So, yes, we anticipated some of these tensions. In many ways, the international community, in this protracted process of negotiations that kind of followed the coup in October of 2021, have propped up and legitimized these two generals who are, in my opinion, criminals who are responsible for war crimes that span decades. In Darfur, South Sudan, other parts of Sudan, these are people that have blood on their hands. And now they're vying for political and economic power at the expense of civilians. They never had an intention to, in my view, transition to civilian rule. And that's what people have been demanding from the very beginning. And it's not just a struggle for political control, it's also a struggle for economic control. The RSF controls most of the gold trade in Sudan, and the SAF controls much of the economy. They own over 250 companies in all kinds of areas, food commodities, etc. So, you know, and I mean, going back to your question about the international community, to me, they've played a negative role, you know, in basically framing these two generals as potential reformists that could bring us closer to civilian rule. The RSF, we have reports that they're getting fuel and weapons through Libya, and the SAF through Egypt. And each of, you know, those countries are also being, like, the RSF is getting support from the UAE and Russia, and, you know, there are other external actors on the SAF side. So there's been international intervention. People need to remember that. What we're asking for is for that kind of damaging international intervention to stop, and for the international community to kind of leverage its power in a coordinated, unified fashion to kind of put their strength behind the African Union, for example, to really force these generals to cease fire, to pressure them to cease fighting. You know, that's the first step here, is we need to stop this fighting, because we're at the brink of a humanitarian catastrophe, really, and a healthcare crisis that is really, I mean, unimaginable. Yeah.
You know, considering the political and geopolitical dynamics, when you look back at the Sudanese revolution and the immediate outcome, what appeared to be somewhat of a win and offering some hope for change, when you look back at that time and reflect on it, do you see anything any differently now from this standpoint?
I mean, you know, the period before the coup, 2021, even though there were also already kind of these negotiations that, for the most part, sidelined the more grassroots pro-democracy forces, like the neighborhood resistance committees and like other kind of feminist and youth-led civil society groups, unions, kind of working class unions, for example. That was already kind of present and disappointing. But there was also, for me at least, you know, that was a period of hope. I mean, it's been incredible, really, to see people coming together in opposition to this military coup regime, to both sides. And, you know, I think what happened, the lesson we need to learn is that those grassroots, kind of the backbone of the revolution, right? These resistance committees and others, they were ignored. They were called naive and unrealistic for demanding a kind of transition to full civilian rule. And, you know, they said they didn't think that we should have any negotiations or compromise or partnerships with the military, with either factions. And they were ignored. You know, the international community that brokered a lot of this kind of protracted negotiation process. It's not that they refused necessarily to negotiate; they just didn't refuse to negotiate with these war criminals. And they also, you know, there were points where, for example, they were invited to a dialogue and they were told, and they asked, you know, for it to be live streamed over Facebook so that anybody in Sudan could access it, and they were told, no, we can't do that. These need to be closed door negotiations. So there were many mistakes that were made in that period of really undermining the kind of backbone of the revolution, the grassroots, and more sort of the forces that represent the regular citizen, and others living in Sudan. So I think, yeah, that was a big mistake. And moving forward, any solution to this after the fighting is ceased needs to really center those groups of people. I mean, clearly they have proven that it is not unrealistic to demand transition to full civilian rule.
Today, there was an executive order signed by the US President Biden levying sanctions related to the conflict. There's looks like this latest ceasefire appears to be more successful than the previous ones. What do you make of the way things are going since you've been able to get out of there? Are there signs that this conflict may be winding down, at least enough to get to the table and to talk? Or are you afraid that this is going to get worse?
I mean, I saw the executive order. It's not very specific, so we're also still waiting on details of what that actually means. You know, it only means so much if there's action behind it. And also, I will say from the U.S., I mean, it's kind of too little, too late. They should have done this before the fighting started. These, you know, war criminals should have never been kind of propped up in this negotiation process and legitimized, right? And so, I mean, for me, I don't really. I think most of us Sudanese don't have the privilege of giving up hope here. You know, the fighting needs to stop, And we need to really, put all of our efforts behind getting a coordinated kind of response and pressure on these generals to stop fighting, and for the steps after that, for it to be a process from which, where lessons learned from the past can be incorporated, and where we don't legitimize these war criminals. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm answering your question correctly, but I haven't really allowed myself to go there in terms of thinking that this could continue for too long, because we're really at the brink of a kind of humanitarian disaster, and even the humanitarian response has been very limited. I mean, we haven't yet seen a kind of coordinated, full-scale response here to get food and water and medicine to the people that most need it. Um, and the ships that evacuated us, they could have come in with food and medicine, and it wasn't until like a week or even 2 weeks later that they started doing that. And there's no excuse for that. So I mean, for me, I think the path forward here is for the damaging forms of international intervention, like the funding and fueling of these two factions, to stop, and for there to be a more unified, coordinated response from the entire international community, regional actors, the US, Europe, etc., to really put their kind of power behind force, really getting them to stop fighting. And then we can start talking about, well, what are the next steps? And that type of engagement needs to be Sudanese led by the resistance committees and the other pro-democracy forces that don't only represent elite interests, but also really represent the kind of needs and wants of all of Sudan, of Sudan's civilians who are caught up in this senseless fighting.
Thanks for watching, and thanks to all of our dedicated viewers that make this work possible. Please support independent journalism by going to one of the links in the description below. Thanks so much.